Look at those Australian troops. The words weren't spoken with respect. They were said casually, dismissively, by American officers who believed the war would be quick and victory guaranteed. What followed would haunt them for decades. Because when the battlefield shifted, when plans collapsed, when chaos replaced confidence, it wasn't American strength that held the line. It was Australian resolve. And the regret that followed wasn't written in reports or medals. It lived in memories, in silence, in the knowledge that bravery had been underestimated until it was too late. This is the story America never forgot. Stay with us. Before we begin, like this video if you value real history. Subscribe for cinematic war documentaries. Comment below, where are you watching from? Now, let's go back to where the regret began. In the early months of the Pacific War, confidence filled American command rooms. The United States had industrial power, manpower, technology. Australia, to many American planners, was seen as a junior partner. Brave, but limited. Tough, but inexperienced in modern mechanized warfare. That assumption would become one of the most painful miscalculations of the war. When Japanese forces surged across Southeast Asia, Allied defenses collapsed faster than expected. British positions fell, Dutch lines crumbled. The Pacific balance shifted overnight. Suddenly, Australia wasn't just an ally. It was the line. The cost of that resolve was paid not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet homes of a nation waiting for its sons. For every medal awarded, a family received a letter sealed with sorrow. The victory parades would come, but for many, the silence of an empty chair would echo louder than any celebration. This was the unseen cost, the private grief behind the public victory. American commanders arrived with strategies drawn on maps thousands of miles away. They spoke of withdrawals, calculated risks, and acceptable losses. The Australians spoke differently. They spoke about holding ground. At places like Milne Bay, Kokoda, and later Buna, Australian troops faced terrain that punished movement and weather that destroyed morale. Jungles swallowed visibility. Disease weakened bodies faster than enemy fire. Supply lines failed and still they stayed. American observers were shocked. Australian units fought without the infrastructure Americans depended on. They adapted tactics on the fly. Small unit leadership replaced rigid doctrine. When supplies ran out, they carried less and moved smarter. There were moments when American commanders questioned why Australians refused to retreat when ordered. The answer was simple. They had nowhere else to go. Australia was not fighting for territory. They were fighting for home. At Milne Bay, Japanese planners expected an easy victory. Allied intelligence underestimated the Japanese advance, and American leadership feared collapse. What happened instead stunned everyone. Australian troops dug in. They rotated units through rain and mud. They counterattacked when doctrine said they shouldn't. They absorbed pressure, and then broke the enemy's momentum. It was the first major land defeat of Japanese forces in the Pacific, and it wasn't led by American divisions. That realization hit hard. At Kokoda Track, the situation worsened. The terrain was brutal beyond planning. Steep ridges, narrow paths, constant rain. Malaria spread faster than orders. Australian soldiers carried wounded comrades for days. They fought while exhausted. They learned jungle warfare the hard way, through survival. American units arriving later admitted something quietly. They had underestimated what this kind of war demanded, and who was already prepared for it. Reports back to American headquarters began changing tone. Australian troops show exceptional endurance. Australian leadership highly adaptive. Morale remained strong despite conditions. These weren't compliments, they were corrections. Because earlier judgments had been wrong. The phrase, "Look at those Australian troops," had started as dismissal. Now it carried weight. Respect replaced doubt, but regret lingered. Because lives had been lost during hesitation. Because support came later than it should have. Because listening earlier might have changed outcomes. The Pacific War forced American command to confront a hard truth. War isn't won by size alone. It's won by resilience, and Australia had that in abundance. By the time American leadership fully understood this, the cost was already written into history. Paid in blood, exhaustion, and lessons learned too late to undo. And that regret, it never fully faded. By mid-1942, the tone inside Allied command rooms had changed. Not dramatically, not publicly, but unmistakably, American officers who once spoke with certainty now asked questions. They reviewed after-action reports more carefully. They listened longer when Australian commanders spoke. Because the battlefield had become a teacher, and it was unforgiving. The Pacific War refused to follow expectations. Supply lines failed. Air superiority didn't guarantee ground success. Equipment designed for Europe struggled in jungles that swallowed vehicles and visibility alike. And through it all, Australian troops kept holding. They adapted without manuals, learned movement by feel. understood the jungle not as an obstacle but as a weapon. American units arriving later observed closely. Patrol techniques, silent communication, how Australians moved without breaking foliage, how they rested without relaxing awareness. This wasn't theory, it was survival knowledge. At Buna and Gona, American forces faced intense resistance and suffered heavy losses. Early assaults stalled, morale wavered. The jungle erased timelines and exhausted soldiers faster than planners expected. Australian units, already bloodied from earlier campaigns, stepped forward again. Not as replacements, but as guides. They shared hard lessons learned the costly way. Don't rush, don't bunch up. Don't underestimate quiet terrain. American commanders began adjusting tactics, smaller units, flexible plans, closer coordination between air and ground forces. The rigid doctrine softened. And something else happened. Mutual respect formed. Not from speeches or medals, but from shared hardship. Officers who once dismissed Australian capabilities now acknowledged their experience. Quiet conversations replaced assumptions. Coordination improved. The battlefield forced equality. Australian leaders, for their part, held no resentment. They didn't seek recognition. They focused on outcomes, holding lines, breaking advances, preserving lives where possible. That professionalism left a mark. One American officer later wrote that Australians fought as if retreat were not an option, because for them, it wasn't. This understanding reshaped strategy. American planners stopped viewing Australia as a supporting partner. They saw it as a cornerstone of Pacific defense. Supply routes shifted, training methods evolved. Jungle warfare schools were expanded. Australian experience became doctrine, but the regret remained, because early dismissals had cost time. Time the enemy used. Time measured in lost ground and lost lives. By late 1942, the Allies were no longer fighting separate efforts. They were fighting together. Australian endurance stabilized the front long enough for American industrial strength to matter. American logistics amplified Australian experience. It was partnership, earned, not assumed. The phrase, "look at those Australian troops," no longer carried humor. It carried meaning. A recognition that courage doesn't announce itself. That experience doesn't always arrive with rank. And that underestimating allies can be as dangerous as underestimating enemies. The Pacific War would continue for years. But from this moment on, one mistake would not be repeated. Australia would never again be viewed as secondary. And America would carry that lesson forward. Quietly, permanently. Because regret isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the silence after learning you should have listened sooner. By 1943, the Pacific War no longer resembled its early chaos. The confusion had not vanished, but it had been disciplined. Joint command structures strengthened, communication lines improved. Planning rooms now included voices that once went unheard. And at the center of that shift stood experience. Australian and American units trained together before deploying. Not symbolically, but practically. Movement drills, night operations, silent coordination in terrain that punished mistakes. The jungle was no longer treated as neutral ground. It was respected. American soldiers learned why Australians traveled light, why they avoided predictable paths, why patience could save more lives than speed. These lessons spread beyond Australia. They reshaped Allied doctrine across the Pacific. From New Guinea to the Solomon Islands, combined operations became more precise. Ground forces coordinated with air and naval units in ways that reduced unnecessary exposure. Intelligence sharing improved. But the most significant change was psychological. Trust replaced hesitation. Where once there had been doubt, there was now reliance. Australian commanders were consulted early in planning phases. Their assessments of terrain and movement were weighted heavily. American leadership acknowledged what the battlefield had proven. That recognition altered outcomes. Operations moved with intention rather than assumption. Smaller engagements were chosen over grand gestures. Supply chains adjusted to local realities instead of theoretical efficiency. And slowly, momentum shifted. Not because one nation dominated, but because cooperation matured. The regret of early underestimation became a quiet motivator, a reminder embedded in every briefing. Listen first, observe, adapt. For Australian troops, this shift carried quiet validation. They had never fought for praise. Their focus remained the mission and the men beside them. But acknowledgement mattered. It strengthened morale. It affirmed sacrifice. It confirmed that their role in the Pacific was not peripheral, but essential. Stories circulated among troops. American soldiers spoke of Australians who refused evacuation until others were secure. Of patrols that returned not because they were ordered, but because they sensed danger ahead. Australians, in turn, recognized American strengths. Logistics that kept units supplied under impossible conditions. Air support that arrived with precision. Medical advancements that saved lives once thought lost. Each side learned where the other excelled. The alliance deepened. not through ceremony, but through survival. By late 1943, the Pacific balance had shifted. The enemy no longer advanced freely. Defensive lines stabilized, counteroffensives became measured and effective. The early mistake, dismissal, had been corrected, but not forgotten. Years later, American military studies would cite these campaigns as turning points in coalition warfare. Not because of technology, but because of humility. The understanding that no ally arrives empty-handed. Every force carries knowledge shaped by geography, culture, and history. Ignoring that knowledge costs lives. Respecting it saves them. This lesson extended beyond the Pacific War. It shaped future alliances, future planning, future assumptions, because the jungle had delivered a truth no classroom could teach. And that truth lingered. Sometimes the greatest strength in war is not firepower, it's listening. When the war finally moved beyond the jungles, something invisible remained behind. A memory, not of defeat but of misjudgment. For American leadership, the early dismissal of Australian capability became a quiet reckoning. Not spoken loudly, not carved into monuments, but remembered in doctrine, in planning rooms, and in the language of future alliances. Because wars are not only won by strength, they are won by understanding. Long after the Pacific campaigns ended, veterans spoke less about tactics and more about moments. Shared rations under rain-soaked canopies, silent marches through terrain that punished arrogance. Decisions made together, not imposed. Those memories shaped how the war was remembered. Australian troops returned home without fanfare. Their role often summarized too briefly. Yet among those who fought beside them, their reputation was unshakable. Reliable, adaptable, unyielding American veterans carried that respect forward. Into training manuals, into joint exercises, into the way Allied forces were approached in later conflicts. The regret was not about one insult, one phrase, or one moment. It was about the cost of assumption. Because assumption delays learning, and delay costs lives. In the decades that followed, military historians revisited the Pacific War with clearer eyes. They noted how early coordination failures gave way to some of the most effective coalition operations of the era. They studied why. The answer was simple. Respect replaced ego. Listening replaced ordering. Experience replaced theory. That shift did not happen overnight. It was earned, step by step, patrol by patrol, decision by decision. The jungle demanded it, and the jungle does not negotiate. Today, when modern armies train together, these lessons echo quietly in the background. Not as accusations, but as reminders. Every ally arrives with something valuable. Local knowledge, hard-earned instincts, ways of thinking shaped by terrain and history. Ignoring that is not just disrespectful, it's dangerous. The Pacific War forced that realization into practice, and it stuck. For Australia and the United States, the conflict became more than shared battles. It became a shared understanding. That partnership endured beyond the war, through treaties, through joint operations, through decades of cooperation shaped by a lesson learned the hard way. Not because one side was perfect, but because both were willing to adapt. The regret that once haunted American command transformed into something stronger than apology. It became change, and change when carried forward becomes legacy. When we look back today, it's easy to frame history as inevitability, as if outcomes were always clear. They weren't. They were shaped by choices. Some flawed, some corrected, some remembered quietly, never spoken aloud. This story is not about blame, it's about growth. About how respect, once earned, reshapes everything that follows. Because the most important victories in war aren't always territorial. Sometimes they happen inside the mind. And once learned, they're never forgotten.